So much, and I'm so honored and touched that our church is able to be part of this panel and to hear about the good work that is going on. Thank you for including us. And I am located in the traditional and unceded territories of the Semi-Amun Nation, like Asim, and our church is located on Coast Salish land, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, and we hold those communities in prayer and in reconciliation. So Yusuf, thank you. You did sort of bring about what all of our siblings, our Muslim siblings, Jewish siblings, where we all have these stories around refugee, but we also, I think, share the spiritual practice of hospitality and how greeting the stranger, we encounter the Holy One in some form. And so that sense of kinship through hospitality, I think, perhaps is one of the reasons faith organizations are drawn to support refugee work. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about why St. Andrew's Wesley has gotten involved in what we've been up to. So I'm representing really a group of 14 tireless volunteers in our church who have been doing this work for about 11 years. And one of the advantages of being the United Church of Canada at the moment is that we, as an organization, have had some concentrated involvement with refugee sponsorship since the 1970s, where we engaged in that work in response to the migration of Vietnam War refugees. And in that time, the government of Canada made the United Church of Canada a sponsorship agreement holder, and that was centralized through the national office in Toronto. But practically speaking, what that means is that whether you are a church of 30 people in northern BC or a church of 400 in Vancouver, you have some of the administrative support and resources to sponsor a refugee and manage the demanding and sometimes confusing paperwork and procedures that it takes. It also means that as a church, we can be poised to support and accompany refugees when crisis strikes. And so, for example, in 2015, in the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis, the government of Canada was able to provide access to us for 750 refugees right in the beginning, and for that call to go out across the country to United Churches. Our particular journey, though, began in November of 2010 when there was an urgent call to sponsor a Palestinian family living in the Al Hol refugee camp in Syria. And our current team leader, former educator Donna Scora, just felt called to gather folks in the congregation right after the worship service to see if there was enough people to make a team. And there most certainly was. And so because of her, we have a very active team of 14 people who work on sponsorship and accompaniment. And to date, those folks have sponsored 15 refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Uganda. But one of the interesting things that we noted in that work is, much like all of us, I think we all thrive in the support and love of community. We noticed there was some additional work we could be doing too. So we started to come into contact with people who were government sponsors and who maybe had arrived already, but maybe didn't have the community supports around them. So we increased that work to providing accompaniment to 20 newcomers. And those folks were from Syria, Afghanistan, Uganda, Brazil, Nigeria. And a lot of that role was, connecting people to education or childcare if it was a family, housing support if they were LGBTQ. It was introducing them to other LGBTQ community where they knew they would be safe and accepted. And so we've learned some beautiful lessons about just humanity, about how we all need that friendship and that safe place to cry, to talk, to dream. And so that's been part of the work as well. We currently have 8 people that we're desperately awaiting during this COVID time, as many of you have spoken to. The sponsorship process is taking much longer. And so right now, members of the team are calling or texting or emailing the sponsorees during this time to help them know that we are still thinking of them, working on their application, and looking at housing, looking at education support, so that they know when they get here, we are excited and ready to support them in their transition. So if you're somebody listening to this panel and you've never sponsored, in addition to the paperwork, what happens generally in our case is once we get confirmation that someone's arriving, the team kicks into gear, secures accommodation, furnishes the apartment, goes to the airport to pick people up, and plans the welcome potluck. And in that first week of arrival, a lot of the support is quite practical, getting ID, social insurance number, and orienting folks to the transit system or the grocery stores, and really understanding that each person that arrives is bringing their own goals, their own hopes, their own skill sets, and also their own traumas. And we've really benefited from having a former social worker on the refugee team. Two other quick pieces. One, our church, as Yusuf mentioned, supports the full inclusion of LGBTQ plus folks. And so the Canadian government has been asking us to accompany LGBTQ plus refugees as part of the sponsorship program. And this has been a beautiful match for us. We have a LGBTQ group in the church, and of course on our board and in our committees as well. And having folks who can provide some specific context about what it's like to be out in Vancouver, and to be able to talk to specific service providers and supports that are for the LGBT community has really been a great bridge. And we're feeling very passionate about this work because I know many of you know, but just for perspective, 77 countries worldwide criminalize same-sex activity, 7 of them with the death penalty. And we've heard from the refugees that we sponsor many personal stories about how they're at much higher risk for persecution, sexual and physical violence, and attacks in the camps and when they're in these transition states. And that's even from their own families as well. So there's some extra urgency there for us. Finally, we've been really lucky. There are so many organizations, as we see on this call, that make great partners who can provide us with information that we might not know, and vice versa. And so when we're working together, we really see the profound effect of that. So we're grateful for folks like the Rainbow Foundation of Hope or the matching grants we've had from the Shapiro Foundation. And one of our key partners now is Rainbow Refugee Vancouver, who's been a huge force for good, both in terms of helping with paperwork and support, but they're just also tireless in terms of working on the issue. And so we've got a formal partnership with them where we're hoping to do some joint mentoring as they create private sponsorship circles. Some of our committee members can provide some support, some mentoring as people go through their first sponsorship. And also it can provide some time for us to all grow and share these skill sets. And I think that's really, really critical. As I mentioned, we are waiting for 8 people that we really hope will start to arrive by the end of this year. And we're continuing to raise money. We've committed $340,000 for the next 3 years of sponsorship. But if anyone is considering it from a personal point of view, maybe I'll leave on this. When I ask our volunteer refugee team what they've learned from refugee sponsorship, it almost always brings them to tears because we are changed by each other. It's very clear that the roles could easily be reversed. And I think the spiritual nature of this work is that it puts us in touch with what I think is our essential humanity. Refugee sponsorship is most definitely not charity work, it is justice work. And it's believing that we as a collective community have the ability to right the moral wrong that anyone should have to flee for their life from their place of birth or community. And so I hope we will continue to do this work together and to take it into the global world so that we actually build a planet that is just and peaceful and abundant for all. Thank you so much for having me on this panel tonight.